At number 10 now, we have the clown. This story comes from a Redditor's history teacher who said that when they were a teenager in Illinois, they got a ride with a large man who offered to drive him home. They got chatting, he seemed quite nice, and he asked the driver why he had a clown suit and makeup kit in the back of his car. Now he said it was because he worked part-time as a party clown. He thought this was a little bit creepy, but logical enough. He got out at his house and thanked the driver, who he said was one of the most polite people he'd ever met. Years later, he found out the driver was none other than John Wayne Gacy Jr., the serial killer who murdered 34 children in the 1970s and worked part-time as a clown. Moving on to number 9 now, we have the creep. This one was told by Hoot Bear on Reddit, and I'm just going to read this in her own words. I was 18 at the time, driving to get some food on my lunch break. I saw a man probably in his 50s trying to hitch a ride. I was pretty hesitant to stop, so I drove by. I felt guilty though, remembering my mom always stopping to help people stranded on the road, homeless, out of gas, etc. So I turned around and offered a ride. He introduced himself with a name I can't remember and thanked me profusely. He apparently had groceries and told me he didn't want his meat to spoil in the hot New Mexico weather. He asked to be dropped off at the post office, which was not too far away. As I drove off, he stared at me for a good minute and the sirens went off in my head. Awkward, creepy and unsettling. After a bit, he blurted out, "You sure are pretty," and asked me for a number. I said, "No, I have a boyfriend and I'm not interested in the least bit." He kept asking and insisting my relationship status was irrelevant. I asked him to stop and he became aggressive. I veered into the closest turning, slammed on my brakes and yelled, "Is it too much to ask for a little good karma every now and then? Get out of my car, you cad." Yes, I said cad. He gave me a blank look, then just got out much to my surprise. He ended up forgetting his groceries, and what scared me most is the fact that there was no meat, just some eggplants and other nonsense. Now that I'm older and hopefully smarter, I will think about who I pick up a little more. That, and it also helps having my 80-pound dog in tow. Moving on to number 8 now, we have the vanishing lady. If you've watched any of my urban legend videos, you may recognize this one. It's sort of a reoccurring theme. In North Carolina, some people still speak of a ghostly hitchhiker known as Lydia, the vanishing lady. People have reported that when driving down the roads there, they see a woman trying to flag down any passing cars. They pull over and the hitchhiker gets in. They tell them her name is Lydia, that she's been to a dance and is now trying to get home. She gives the driver an address not too far away and they agree to take her there. Upon arrival, the driver will turn around to find that Lydia has vanished. Confused, they go to the door and ring the bell. An old woman answers. They explain that they picked up a woman called Lydia who wanted to be taken here, but that she just disappeared. The old woman will smile faintly. She will produce a silver picture frame with a photograph of the hitchhiking woman. The old woman will say to them, "Lydia was my daughter. She died in a car wreck by the overpass in 1923. You're not the first one, and I suppose you won't be the last. Every so often, her spirit flags down a passing driver. I suppose she still doesn't understand what happened to her. I suppose she's still trying to get home." Next up at number 7 now, we have shotgun. This one comes from Sumat Comments. He said his older brother picked up a hitchhiker once after a night of light drinking. Just want to say, not cool. Don't even drink lightly if you're driving. After driving for a few minutes, the man pulled out a shotgun and declared that he was going to steal the car. He wasn't having any of that though, and so he slammed the brakes on his car and then tried to pull the hitchhiker out of the car and onto the ground. The hitchhiker then pulled the trigger on the shotgun and blew off a chunk of the brother's bicep before then just running off into the woods. Apparently the brother made a decent recovery but still has a chunk missing from his arm and isn't able to lift heavy things anymore. God. Next up at number 6 now, we have Thomas Prendergast. In November 1958, this man picked up 16-year-old hitchhiker Carl Alfred Eder from New York. Eder was homeless and Thomas felt bad for him, but he decided to let him stay with him and his family while he got back on his feet. One day, Thomas got back from work to find that Eder was already standing outside of the house. Eder asked Thomas for a ride to San Diego. Thomas took Eder to the service station for the bus after saying he couldn't take him all the way to San Diego. When Thomas returned home, he made a horrifying discovery. Inside, he found his wife Lois had been shot to death. The couple's 4 children, all younger than 9, had been murdered with a hunting knife. Eder was captured 2 days later. He told police he had snapped when one of the children made too much noise. He was sentenced to life in prison but escaped after 16 years, leaving behind a note that read, "I've done enough time and I'm leaving." He is still on the loose to this day. If he is still alive, Ida is now 76 years old. There is currently a $20,000 reward for his capture. Moving on to number 5 now, we have Amy Billig. On March 5th, 1974, 17-year-old Amy hitchhiked through the Miami area on her own. She was planning to visit her father's office but never arrived at her destination. Amy's camera was found, but she never was. As the case went cold, Amy's own mother, Susan, took it upon herself to find her daughter. She was led on many wild goose chases across the country that yielded no results. Eventually, a biker named Paul Brunch told Susan that Amy had been abducted while hitchhiking by a biker gang named the Pagans. On his deathbed, Paul is said to have confessed to his wife that Amy actually overdosed on the same day she disappeared while attending a party hosted by the Pagans. They decided to feed her bodies to alligators in the Florida Everglades. Susan died in 2005, still no closer to finding out the truth of what happened to her daughter and if those brutal rumors were true. Coming at number 4 now, we have Back of the Head. This one was told by Very Sleepy 24. They said, "There's this middle-aged man who lives in a town where I'm from. He was a genuinely sweet and caring person, and mind, this is a really small town. One day, he picked up a hitchhiker just outside of town. He told him to jump in the bed of the truck and he'll drive him to Walmart. About halfway there, the hitchhiker shot him in the back of the head for no reason. He didn't even steal anything, and if I remember correctly, he got caught. Henry didn't die, but he's been permanently disabled and has severe brain damage. I remember when I first heard that, and it scared the crap out of me. That was probably about 12 years ago, but I still think about that anytime someone talks about hitchhikers. It scares me to think someone would just do something like that just because." Moving on to number 3 now, we have the Valhalla Hitchhiker. This one is in the same vein as the Vanishing Lady we talked about earlier in the video. In South Carolina, local legend says that in the 1950s, a pilot called Larry Stevens was flying over Oconee County when a hailstorm hit the area. Stevens couldn't see a thing and ended up crashing into some mountains near a local highway in the Valhalla area. Ever since then, locals have reported encounters with a hitchhiker dressed in a dark all-weather coat. He usually appears on dark and stormy nights and asks for a different location depending on the direction of the car. It's believed that the Valhalla Hitchhiker is actually Larry Stevens. They say he looks like him and that he's even dressed in the same pilot clothes as Stevens was on the day he died. Next up at number 2 now, we have the stabbing. In 2016, a Polish man called Merrick was travelling across Ireland. After getting buses along the way, he decided he would try and do some hitchhiking. After a while, a family driving in a white Nissan hatchback picked him up. There were 2 children in the back of the car. One was about 7 or 8 and the other was just a 6-month-old baby. Merrick climbed into the car and started chatting about his travels. Everything seemed fine at first, but after 15 minutes he heard all the car doors lock. Merrick remembered seeing the female passenger sending a text to someone just a few minutes before. The male driver came off the main road and pulled over. A green car pulled up nearby. A man and a woman got out and started approaching them. He threw his wallet out the window and told them to just take his money, but they didn't want that. The 2 new people and the driver of the car produced knives and proceeded to stab Merrick so many times that when paramedics arrived on the scene, he was told he was 5 minutes away from losing his life. Merrick said the scariest part for him was that the driver looked so happy while stabbing him. It's been a long road to recovery, but Merrick did survive. The perpetrators have never been found though. And finally, number 1 now, we have the orange sock. On January 6, 1982, 29-year-old Bobby Jo Oberholzer phoned her husband Jeff to let him know that she was hanging out at a bar with friends and she was going to hitchhike home. She never made it back though. Jeff searched for her the next day and eventually found Bobby's body in a remote field. She was riddled with bullets. Strangely, an orange sock that did not belong to her was found nearby. 6 months later, the body of 21-year-old missing woman Annette K was found 13 miles away from where Bobby's was found. Here's where it gets really strange though. Annette was wearing the matching orange sock. Now police believe it was the same killer who had picked up the hitchhikers and murdered them. Annette's orange sock was likely left behind in the killer's vehicle and somehow fell out at the location Bobby was murdered. Jeff was originally a suspect in the case, but his name was finally cleared, leaving the orange sock murders officially unsolved.
First up, in our number 10 spot, we have the nice couple. One night, a man was hitchhiking across the US and he got into a car with a couple. They seemed pretty nice, nothing out of the ordinary. Not a long while though, after when the man had gotten home, he saw the couple on the news. Apparently they had killed a man earlier that day and they were driving with a corpse in the car. Not only that, but they had robbed and killed a few men prior to this day, leaving this man with his mouth hanging open. This is why I have never and will never hitchhike.
Coming at number 9 now, we have Ben Rhodes. On April 1st, 1990, an Arizona police officer pulled over to check on a truck that had stopped by the side of the road. He got chatting to the truck driver and decided to investigate inside the cab. There, he discovered a naked woman, handcuffed and screaming. She had welts on her body, cuts on her mouth, and a horse bridle around her neck. The officer arrested him and found a bunch of other torture devices in his briefcase. It turned out that Rhodes had been torturing female hitchhikers for 15 years across the American South. When the case came to court, the jury was shown this picture of 14-year-old Regina Walters, a runaway from Texas. It was taken not long before he strangled her to death. He was sentenced to life in prison. At number 8 now, we have Philip Fraser. In 1988, this 25-year-old from Alaska was driving to Washington State to enroll in a medical course. After crossing into Canada, he stopped at a cafe. It was there that he met a male hitchhiker who asked him for a ride. Now, workers at the cafe said they didn't like the vibe from the hitchhiker, and one of them said that Philip would live to regret picking him up. They were right. It was the last time Philip was ever seen alive. On July 27th, his body was found in a remote gravel pit. His passport and all of his documents were gone. On the same day he was murdered, a couple helped a motorist who had car trouble. He was driving Philip's car. They let him stay the night at their place, and he told them his backstory that was identical to Philip's. The hitchhiker had murdered him and taken his identity. Next up at number 7 now, we have a story from Kwa Thurma. This is the town where a man was hitchhiking in South Africa in 2016. He got into the car where there were 2 men in the front who didn't say anything to him. Shortly after, 2 more men got in on either side of the back seats with him in the middle. They told him that he had got into the wrong car and they punched him over and over again. The driver of the car then took out a gun and handed it to one of the men in the back. Then they tied him up, they kept punching him, and then they shot him in the leg repeatedly. He managed to untie himself somehow and distract the driver, who then smashed into a house. The men all then fled the scene, leaving him for dead. Luckily, he survived and the police are still investigating. Coming at number 6 now, we have the sperm donor. In February 2016, a man was hitchhiking through Zimbabwe when he was kidnapped by 3 women who sexually assaulted him and forced him to be a sperm donor. Seriously, they took his semen. It's thought they might have taken the sperm for a traditional luck-enhancing juju ritual, and it's not the first time it's happened there either. Ever since 2012, men there have been drugged at gun or knife point, given sexual stimulants, and forced to have sex for their semen. Coming at number 5 now, we have the highway of death. From the early 1980s all the way to the 2000s, bodies of hitchhikers kept appearing on an 800-kilometer stretch of highway in the Australian outback. It all started when hitchhiker Tony Jones vanished without a trace in 1982. Over the years, dead bodies of children were found, sexually abused. So was the body of 18-year-old Catherine Graham. 4 other people were found shot dead, 2 others just disappeared. The murders are still unsolved, and people are left discussing whether it was different murderers or a single person that's slaughtering these hitchhikers. There's $250,000 for any information that could help solve the case. Moving on to number 4 now, we have Walhalla. Anyone who lives along the 107 highway in South Carolina will tell you about the Walhalla Hitcher, a ghost-like man wearing an all-weather coat. He is said to only ever appear on a dark, stormy night, flag down cars, and depending on which direction you're heading, he'll ask for a different destination at the end of the road, either Piedmont Overlook or Moody Springs. He never ever talks, and when he exits the vehicle at his destination, he vanishes. Some people say it's the ghost of Larry Stevens, a pilot who crashed into the mountains nearby during a storm in the 1950s. So if any of you guys find ghosts and hitchhiking scary, you know where you need to visit next. Coming in at number 3 now, we have castration. In 1982, 22-year-old Marty shook when hitchhiking from Nevada to Colorado. 2 days later, his body was found in a canyon in Utah. He had been shot in the back of the head, and strangely, his genitals had been removed. 7 years later, the police connected this with a case from the previous year. 30-year-old Wayne Riffendiefer was found dead in a wooded area. He had been shot with the same gun and also had his genitals removed. Then a third case was linked from 1986. 26-year-old hitchhiker Jack Andrews was found dead at a rest stop. His genitals were missing too. The men were all said to resemble each other. Their murders or any connection between them remain an unsolved mystery to this day. At the number 2 spot now, we have the kidnapping of Colleen Stan. In 1977, 20-year-old Colleen Stan was hitchhiking from her home in Oregon to attend her friend's birthday party in California. She was an experienced hitchhiker and got into the van of Cameron Cameron Hooker. Now she said she felt safe with him because he had his wife and baby in the car. When they stopped at the gas station, she felt a voice telling her to just jump out and run and never look back. That would have been the right decision because Colleen was then kidnapped at knife point. She was then held as Cameron Hooker's prisoner for 7 years. She became his sex slave and had to live under their waterbed for 23 hours a day. When she finally escaped, he was sentenced to 104 years in prison. And finally, number 1 now, we have the Alphabet Killer. Real name Joseph Naso. This killer murdered prostitutes from the 1970s to the 90s. He was called the Alphabet Killer because he killed women whose first and last names started with the same letter. His victims included Roxanne Rogast, Carmen Colon, and Tracy Tafoya. That's why it was only ever going to end in tragedy when he picked up Pamela Parson. She was hitchhiking home and offered him sex. He declined and killed her. He was arrested in 2010 after detectives discovered his diary of sexual assaults and a list of dumping grounds. Well, that was grim. It started grim and it just got grimmer. Starting off at number 10 now, we have the Triangle of Death. In the 1980s, the Marne region of France became known as the Triangle of Death. Young army soldiers from 3 different garrisons in the area kept mysteriously disappearing, often while hitchhiking. It started in 1980 with 19-year-old Patrick Dubois. Over the next 7 years, 7 more men vanished in the area. After a year, the police's investigation led them to Pierre Chanel as a culprit. He was also a former officer in the French army. A police patrol found him in a camper van parked suspiciously by the side of a country road. They discovered he'd been videotaping the rape and torture of a Hungarian hitchhiker he'd abducted. He was given 10 years in prison for the crime and released on probation in 1995. Afterwards though, advances in DNA evidence found traces of 3 of the missing soldiers that had vanished in the Triangle of Death in the years before. In 2001, Chanel was charged with 3 of those murders. In 2003, not long after the start of his trial, he committed suicide in his prison hospital.
In our number 9 spot today, we have The Cousin. This is a story that comes from Reddit user Gruselig, and it is a story about their cousin. Basically, back in the 70s, their aunt's eldest son was known to hitchhike quite a bit throughout New Brunswick. One summer, unfortunately, however, he ended up going missing. To this day, he has still never been found despite police investigations. It is believed that the most likely case is that he was doing his regular thing of hitchhiking, but ended up getting into the car of someone who had terrible, sinister intentions. They believe that he likely got in the car of someone who ended up taking his life, and they believe that they may have placed his body in the St. John River. The storyteller heard this story many times growing up from their mother in order to discourage them from taking up the practice themselves. I think it's safe to say that it probably worked.
Next up, in our number 8 spot, we have the Walmart Hitchhiker. This is another one that makes me shake in my booties, and I'm not even wearing booties. This is a story that happened to a friend of mine. 90s babies? Please, someone for the love of God get this reference. This is a story about a sweet old man named Henry who lived in the same town as the Reddit user who told the story. So first off, that just makes this way more frightening. It's one thing to hear these stories, but to know someone firsthand, terrifying. Anyways, he was known to be genuinely sweet and caring, and so you can imagine the shock it brought to the town to hear what happened to him. One night, he picked up a hitchhiker just outside of town. He apparently told the hitchhiker to jump in the bed of the truck and that he would drive him to the closest Walmart. But of course, as you can probably tell where the story is going, the hitchhiker proceeded to shoot the old man in the back of the head for no reason at all. Yep, after further investigation, the hitchhiker didn't steal anything, so there is seemingly no reason. Henry thankfully did not die from this, as you would think, but he did suffer major brain damage and he is sadly permanently disabled. Is it possible that this sweet old man had enemies? Or do you think he actually was shot for no reason? Leave a comment below and let us know what you think.
In our number 7 spot today, we have He Was a Nice Guy. This story comes from the Reddit user Raccoon Yeti Kiwi, and they explain that this hitchhiking story starts off when they were in the car with their dad driving. Their dad stopped to pick up a hitchhiker, but when you hear how this guy looked, you'll be just as confused as I am as to why they stopped to pick this man up. They explained that he was picked up while it was raining, that this man had long hair that covered his eyes, and that he was carrying an axe. I don't know, I wouldn't, would you? Turns out though, the guy was super polite. They just dropped him off where he needed to go, no questions asked, everyone was all good. Maybe he was just a nice guy and didn't realize how menacing carrying an axe was. I don't know.
Coming up in our number 6 spot today, we have the clown. As the story goes, a teacher that lived in Cook County, Illinois, was walking around his town when he was offered a ride home by, as he described, a largish man. While driving, he noticed a clown suit and a giant makeup kit in the back seat. When he inquired about it, the man said that he was a part-time clown. Naturally, why else would you have a clown suit in your car? Well, a few years later, this teacher found out that this man was actually John Wayne Gacy Jr. Yep, the clown murderer himself. I remember when I was a kid, I had a friend that was so scared of clowns, and I remember thinking, oh my gosh, what a baby. But now as an adult, I'm like, yeah, hell no. They're very creepy. Apologies to any clowns watching Hollywood and Murderers Have Done You Dirty. I'm sure you're nice people.
In our number 5 spot today, we have I didn't know. So this story comes from someone who has a hitchhiking background. Like, they used to hitchhike in their youth, and now themselves they have begun picking up hitchhikers. You know, they get the lifestyle is all I'm trying to say. So fast forward to current times, this story is one that they recall as their strangest hitchhiking experience, and it's one where they're picking up a stranger, as one does. So basically, he picked up this guy who was walking in the middle of the desert, apparently while he was doing long haul trucking. It was the time of year where the weather is just absolutely unforgiving, and that's definitely part of the reason why he picked this guy up. So he picks him up, the guy gets in, and together they travel for about 300 miles before they end up getting pulled over by the police. After being pulled over, this guy ends up getting arrested. Turns out that this guy had some sort of warrant, and the storyteller almost got charged with aiding and abetting a criminal. In the end, especially since he was a completely innocent third party, the storyteller ended up getting sent off on his way, and apparently the hitchhiker was also released not too long later. Wonder what he got arrested for.
In our 4th spot today, we have the tough brother. This story is told by the victim's brother. Apparently one night his brother picked up a hitchhiker after a long night of drinking. Probably the worst time to pick up a hitchhiker, am I right? Out of nowhere, the hitchhiker pulled out a and proceeded to tell the brother that he was stealing his car. The brother was quite tough and into heavy lifting and such, and so he thought, you know, he could take him. He then tackled the hitchhiker, only to be shot in the bicep. A big chunk of his bicep was blown off. The hitchhiker was caught by the cops, hooray, but unfortunately, the brother can no longer do heavy lifting.
In our number 3 spot today, we have a close call. This is a Reddit story that comes from the user A Brutal Cow, and they wrote, quote, "Not my story, but my dad's. He was traveling through Arizona on his way to Mexico. He looked to the side of the road and saw a man hitchhiking. My dad pulled over and asked where this guy is going, to which the man said, the next town over. My dad, being a very trusting man, and this being the 70s or 80s, decided he would give him a ride. While they were driving, they started talking and my father asked for his name. His name was Derp. My dad, quite shocked, looked at him and replied, holy crap, that's my name. They had a few small conversations, and at the next town, my dad let him out and continued to Mexico. He eventually reached the border. He pulled up and the border official asked to see his license. He took a good long look at his license. The official then took off his big aviator sunglasses and told him to pull over to the side. My dad got out of the car and they put him in a room while they searched his car. In the end, the dad was sitting in a room waiting for the next few hours, and when the officer walked back in, he received quite a shock. The officer apologized for the long wait and then explained that the man that this dad had picked up had a warrant out for his arrest. The dad asked what the warrant was for, and the officer replied, homicide.
Coming up in our 2nd spot today, we have the You Are Pretty Man. Okay, this story is such a cause for anxiety for me as it deals with potential assault, and this is the first reason I would never pick up a hitchhiker. The second would obviously be fear of being murdered, naturally. The story is told by a woman who was reflecting on her experience of being 18 and driving home from her lunch break. She spotted a 50-year-old man looking to hitchhike, and her first instinct was to ignore him. But then guilt flooded upon her as she remembered her mom and how she would always stop to help people. So she turned around and asked the man if he needed help. He immediately thanked her and said he had some groceries and meat that he didn't want to go bad, so he was very grateful for her. He asked her to drop him off at the post office nearby. So she began driving, and it wasn't even a minute before she noticed that he was just staring at her. Alarms went off in her head. He blurted out, "You sure are pretty," and then proceeded to ask her for her number. She told him no, and that she has a boyfriend, but he continued to persist. She asked him to please stop, but he got more and more aggressive. She slammed on her brakes and yelled, "Is it too much to ask for a little good karma every now and then? Get out of my car, you cad." Yes, She said cat. He must have been taken aback by the reaction, but he ended up staring blankly at her and proceeded to get out of the car, much to her surprise. He forgot his groceries, and there was actually no meat in them, which just creeped her out even more. I was sure the story was going to have a much worse ending than that, but still super nerve-wracking for anyone to have to endure.
In our number 1 spot today, we have kindness goes a long way. Okay, so this is actually a wild story, and it happened to someone's friend who is named Nikki. Apparently, Nikki is just one of those like insanely sweet people who is just like a ray of sunshine and lives her life with kindness first. That is exactly what led her to one day pick up a hitchhiker. Apparently, this guy was a little shy at first, but was extremely polite, and throughout their trip, the two got to talking and actually got on pretty well. They ended up taking a pit stop at one point to grab dinner, and she happily paid for them both. Apparently, when she paid, he seemed a little flustered and awkward, but part of their conversation was about how he was pretty strapped for cash, hence the reason he was hitchhiking in the first place, and since she wasn't in the same boat, she had no problem treating them both. When she dropped him off, he asked Nikki for her phone number so that potentially sometime in the future they could catch up. She excitedly passed her number along, stoked at the idea of one day being able to catch up with this new friend. After about a week since she dropped him off, Nikki did receive a phone call from her new driving friend. This guy says to her on the phone that she should be glad she was raised to be so kind, because when he initially got in the car, he was planning on killing her and stealing her car. Once he got in and saw how kind she was, and with her buying him dinner and all of that, he just couldn't bring himself to go through with it. He finished off this terrifying conversation by saying, quote, "Please, please, Nikki, please, never ever pick up another hitchhiker." He then hung up, and she was never able to get into contact with this man ever again since he called her from a payphone. Safe to say, she probably heeded that advice.